So I've been using the Switch 2 since June, and yeah, I've got some thoughts. If you're a handheld gamer, you're probably gonna love it, but is it worth it at the price it is right now? Well, let's talk about it. Hi, welcome to the TC. My name's David, and today we're gonna be taking a look at the Nintendo Switch 2. Is it the next level, or is it game over? Let's find that out today. Now, for being honest, the Nintendo Switch 2 is pretty similar to the original Switch design. The difference now being that it has magnetic Joy-Cons and of course a much larger footprint. I do enjoy the magnetic Joy-Cons though. I do like the satisfying click it has, as well as the more premium feel of the entire console and Joy-Cons together. There's less visible seams, and it just feels like a more thought out process versus sliding on the Joy-Cons. The screen is also much more usable, being a lot larger and clearer. However, the overall design of the Switch 2 is pretty much derivative of the original Switch. It's not a mind-blowing difference, but it is nice to have. The stand itself is a lot more stable as well, and if you compare it to like the original Switch, it had that really finicky kind of cheap feeling stand that honestly could just pop off at any time. This one is much more substantial. However, I still feel like it is a pretty thin plastic, and when you put pressure on the middle, it does feel like it might snap. So, something to be mindful of. And as for the colors of the Nintendo Switch 2, well, Nintendo is giving you multiple colors, as long as you really love the color black. Unfortunately, the Nintendo Switch 2 only comes in black as of the filming of this video, but I'm sure that Nintendo is going to be releasing some new colors in the future, so you can keep an eye out for that. As of right now though, the current Nintendo Switch 2 console only comes in a black color, with each Joy-Con having a neon red and a neon blue color on the insides as well as on the surrounding of the joysticks. If your OG Switch works fine, you probably won't notice a huge difference in terms of usability. If anything, the smaller size of the original Nintendo Switch actually might be more portable compared to the larger Nintendo Switch 2. I did notice though that the thickness of these two devices are pretty much exactly the same. So if you're worried about how thick it is or how wide it might be inside of a bag, you don't have to worry about that necessarily. It is longer and taller though. Now look, if you're playing your Switch on handheld mode most of the time, I think that this Switch 2 is a huge upgrade over the original Switch. The screen is a much better screen. It's now 7.9 inches versus the 6.2 inches of the original Switch. The colors are much brighter and more vibrant. The screen panel itself gets a lot brighter, and it's just a much more overall better screen than what was on the original Switch. Now, is it better than the OLED Switch? Well, it's a bit debatable. This is an LCD panel, however, I will say that it is one of the better LCD panels that I've seen. The colors seem to be very accurate and nice and crisp, and the resolution being at 1080p does make a huge difference in terms of usability. I think that if you have an OLED Switch, of course you're going to see a difference with things like black levels and colors. However, the extra brightness that the Nintendo Switch 2 has is a pretty nice feature to have, as well as, of course, the larger size. There's also support up to 120 frames per second, but that's limited to certain games. You'll likely see 60 frames per second on most of the games that you're playing on the Nintendo Switch 2. Of course, if you're playing Nintendo Switch 1 games on your Switch 2 though, there are some games that haven't been updated for the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. But if you are using upgraded games such as Zelda, and you paid for the upgrade, which that's another story, then you'll see 60 frames per second in those games, and an updated boost to resolution. And I think that's where the Nintendo Switch 2 really shines. Just having a much more usable resolution and frame rate compared to the original Switch makes this console a lot more enjoyable to use, whether you're playing handheld or docked. But that brighter and bigger screen must have a few drawbacks as well, right? And yeah, you'd be correct. The battery life on the Switch 2 is quite a bit worse in my opinion than the Switch 1. Of course, the Switch 1 doesn't have a very power-hungry processor, nor a very power-hungry screen, but the larger screen and better processor in the Switch 2 does mean that the battery life is kind of sacrificed. The battery is not very large. If anything, it's about the same size as what you'll have in a smartphone, and when you're powering a screen as large as 7.9 inches and up to 120 frames per second, then yeah, it's definitely going to hit your battery life pretty hard. I think if you're playing this console portably and you're planning on having really long sessions, you might want to consider having a portable power bank or just being close to a wall outlet. And that's kind of a shame because I think where the Nintendo Switch really shines is in that portable mode. Like if you're playing on a bus or if you're playing on a train or a plane. Honestly, that's where the Nintendo Switch really comes into it, and it lets you play these bigger games on a nice handheld console when you're on the go. But if battery life isn't that good, then it's just something to really consider. Are you able to squeeze in those gaming sessions using this console? Or are you really going to have to bring on another battery bank and another cord just to keep it running? Now, here's where things get really tricky. The Nintendo Switch 2 is priced at $500. Of course, there is the non-bundle version, which is $449, but let's be realistic, most of the people who are buying the Nintendo Switch 2 are likely going to be picking up in the bundle configuration. And I don't see any problem with that. If you can get a discount on Mario Kart, I think that's a really great way to save some money later down the line, especially now that games are costing upwards of $80 to $90. And that's where the Switch 2 really kind of irks me. It's a very expensive console with very expensive hardware and expensive games. And then when you compare it to bigger consoles such as the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, those consoles also cost the same amount of money. Of course, now you can probably find pretty good discounts on them. However, the Switch 2 is technically the newest console of the three. I will say that it is a lot easier to find the Switch 2 in stores though compared to those consoles at release, especially now that scalpers can't really, well, scalp it. The stock of the Switch 2 is a lot better than I was expecting, and honestly, you can just walk into your store and probably find one pretty easily. So definitely don't go on a scalper route on looking on like Facebook Marketplace or eBay. You can definitely get it at the store for retail price. But talking about pricing, have you guys also noticed that the OG Switch has actually increased in price? Even the OLED Switch 1 is just a $50 difference from the Nintendo Switch 2, and I think that this is a very intentional move from Nintendo to push sales of the Switch 2 over the original consoles. I can't really remember a time where the original consoles increased in price, whereas the new consoles stayed the same price, but given that we're in this situation with the whole tariffs, I wouldn't be surprised to see consoles and games and accessories continue to increase in price as there's more uncertainty about how much the tariffs are going to affect pricing. If you are interested in the Nintendo Switch 2, I don't have any affiliate links. My advice to you would be just to go to your local store. Honestly, Costco has a pretty good bundle right now where you can get the Nintendo Switch 2 with Mario Kart and a Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pass subscription for just $525 altogether. That means that you save $25 on the subscription as well as savings on the game too. So that is something to consider. I feel like that's probably one of the better deals going on right now. If you also have a Target Red card, it doesn't have to be a credit card, it can be a debit card, you actually get 5% off on the console no matter what. So that's another way to save some money on the Nintendo Switch 2. Speaking about costs increasing though, as you guys have probably seen, at least in the US, the cost of the accessories for the Nintendo Switch 2 has also increased. And of course, this is due to the tariff situation, like I said earlier. However, I don't see these items really going down anytime soon. So if you are interested in buying a Nintendo Switch 2, I would definitely look as to getting it sooner rather than later. I can't imagine that there's going to be any really big sales going on later on in the year, especially since that this console is still pretty new. Everything from the controllers to the docks to different accessories and bags and just overall everything, even SD cards have increased in price for the Nintendo Switch 2. And speaking of SD cards, you will need to use an SD Express protocol SD card. It's a newer kind of SD card, and I haven't really heard about it until I heard about the Nintendo Switch 2 and having to use those cards. But the thing to remember about them are that they are quite a bit more expensive than your typical SD card. They are faster, so I will give them that. But it is something to consider. It's an added cost, and with the consoles now, they do have more internal storage. The Nintendo Switch 2 actually has 256 gigabytes of internal storage, but you might find that going pretty quickly with the games for Nintendo Switch 2 because they are quite a bit larger than the OG Switch. And that's another thing too, the games. Well, as of right now, there's only 2 real games that are AAA titles for the Nintendo Switch 2, and arguably, those would be Mario Kart World, as well as Donkey Kong Bonanza. And I think that those 2 titles, while good, isn't really enough to sell the Switch as it is right now. Of course, more titles are going to be coming out, but it's also something to consider that the games are quite a bit more expensive. they're going to require more storage, and that storage is also more money. And yeah, just overall, everything has gone up way more expensive. And I think that if you are interested in Nintendo Switch 2, those are costs that you're going to have to think about. And speaking about the games too, Nintendo also released something called the game key cards. And essentially they're like a physical game key card. And, like when you buy a physical game, you have a case and there's a card in there. However, these cards don't actually have the game installed on them. They're basically a license for you to download the games onto your Switch 2 console, and it uses that card to check that you do own the game. So while it doesn't have the game physically on the card, it's like a key allowing you to download the game and use it on your device. Now, this is pretty controversial because if you're like me and you like having physical games, is it really a physical game that you own, or is it more just a license to use that game in a physical form? And Nintendo says that they're doing this for smaller developers since the game cards do cost a lot to manufacture and download your games onto. However, I don't know. I just feel like it's kind of a way for them to possibly take away these games later on in the future. As you know, online services do expire. They do stop working over time. And it's going to be interesting to see, like, how does this console hold up, 10 years down the line? Are these games going to still exist 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line? Or will it just be an online program that you can't use anymore? So I am curious to see what you guys think about the game keycard system. Is that something that you guys think is a smart move, or is it more one towards trying to make more money? Now, there's another feature on the Switch 2 that I want to talk about, and that's game chat. It was pushed pretty hard during the presentation for the Switch 2. However, in my time owning the Switch 2, I've only pressed it once, and it was by accident. So I'm not really sure it's a feature that most people are going to use. And tying it to a subscription model for their online subscription, I kind of feel like a double-edged sword. I know you get it for free for 1 year, but the reality is I can't imagine most people are really using this feature, especially when you can do something called calling for free on your phone or your tablet or your computer. And yeah, I just can't really see game chat becoming a really big feature. I mean, obviously that might just be me, but if you are someone who are interested in game chat, of course you do get 1 year for free. After that, you will need a subscription to continue using it. I kind of wish that they had allowed you to customize that button though. I mean, it literally has the letter C on it, so it would be the perfect button for customization. So I don't know, maybe in a future update they will, but knowing Nintendo, they are going to be strict on having this button be only for game chat. Of course, we can't forget why people buy the Nintendo Switch though, and a lot of that comes down to Nintendo exclusives. If you're someone who really enjoys Nintendo games, you're likely to pick up a Switch 2 regardless of the cost or whether or not the Switch 1 is still working for you. You want the best of the best. You want to have the best experience, and you want the games that you played on the Switch 1 to run even better. And a lot of them do. However, is it worth $500 to basically get that experience? Well, I think that's kind of tricky. If you have an OG Switch 1 and you use it mostly docked, I don't think it's worth it, to be honest. You do get niceties with the Nintendo Switch 2. It is a much faster console, and of course, you do get the 4K resolution when docked. However, 1080p on a TV is not bad at all. I will say the biggest thing for me, though, is the frame rate, and I think that that's where the Nintendo Switch 2 really comes into play. Having 60 frames per second and a locked 60 frames per second makes a huge difference. However, if you're fine playing your Nintendo Switch 1 games already, then you're probably going to continue being fine playing them. Of course, if you're looking at Nintendo Switch 2 exclusives, then this might change your mind. And if you still have a Nintendo Switch 1, I don't know if you necessarily need to upgrade. For me, I actually upgraded because the screen on my Nintendo Switch 1 actually broke, and I was trying to think about the cost benefit of replacing my screen versus just using that money towards the Switch 2. And ultimately, I decided on getting a Switch 2 since I do enjoy playing my console handheld. But for docked players, I can't imagine that there would be a huge difference for you unless you just want that faster frame rate and you want those newer titles. It's actually pretty interesting to think about the difference in approaches that Sony and Microsoft have had to their consoles versus Nintendo. I think that Sony and Microsoft are trying to push a more subscription-based game model, whereas Nintendo is definitely more towards catering to an audience that likes Nintendo games and wants them to be stuck in that Nintendo ecosystem. And I think with either console, you can't really go wrong necessarily. It just depends on what kind of games you enjoy playing. For me, I have a PC and I use that for my Xbox and PlayStation games. And it works perfectly. And especially with things like Game Pass now, there's not really any reason to purchase something like an Xbox unless you're trying to get just an easy experience on using and playing your games. And I feel like that's where the Nintendo Switch kind of splits it for me. It is both a console that you can enjoy at home, but also one that you can bring on the go. And really, I don't think you could do that too much with something like an Xbox or a PlayStation. There is obviously other handhelds out there, but it just kind of depends on how easy do you want your experience to be and what kind of games you enjoy playing. So here's some final thoughts on where I land with the Nintendo Switch 2. If you're a handheld first player and you want smoother graphics, a nicer experience with the handheld feeling, as well as just a better screen overall, then yeah, I would say buying the Nintendo Switch 2 is probably worth it. If you're on the fence though, I would say that I would just wait for a different exclusive or a sale, or just seeing how things go with the Nintendo Switch 2. It is a fairly new console, and I can imagine a year down the line that things might look quite a bit different with more exclusive games and just overall a more built-up ecosystem. And finally, if you've got a working Nintendo Switch 1, honestly, I don't know if it's necessarily worth it to buy the Nintendo Switch 2. Pretty much the Nintendo Switch 2 is just an upgraded Switch 1. In a lot of ways, if you're someone who likes to use their Nintendo Switch 1 in a docked mode, I don't see any real reason to upgrade necessarily unless you're looking for those newer titles or better just overall experience. And for most casual gamers, I would say no, just wait. Save your $500 and see where things go in the future. I don't necessarily think it's something that you need to get right now. So overall, I do think that Nintendo nailed a lot of the things about the Switch 2. They did upgrade pretty much every component from the Switch 1 while still retaining a lot of the design elements and just kind of feel of the original Switch. I mean, even the software itself is pretty much one-to-one of the original Switch. Now, do I think that the Nintendo Switch 2 is worth it? Well, it just kind of depends on your use case. And I feel like a lot of the decisions that Nintendo has made feel a bit strategic. Upping the prices of the original Switch, as well as just increasing the costs for all the accessories, definitely makes the Nintendo Switch 2 feel a bit like a cash grab. And I know that's not necessarily what they're trying to go for, but it just feels like it. Between raising the prices of the OG Switch, keeping the prices of the Switch 2 high, and locking certain features behind a paywall, it does feel like Nintendo is trying to push people towards buying the Nintendo Switch 2 over something like the OG Switch. And I don't know, that just feels a little predatory to me. I do think that the Nintendo Switch 2 is a much better overall console than the original Switch was, but I mean, of course it's going to be. They took their lessons from the original Switch and used them to create the Switch 2. And I do think that they fixed a lot of the quirks and kind of bad things about the Switch 1. However, there's still some things about the Switch 2 that can be improved, notably battery life. So I want to know, what do you guys think? Do you think that the Switch 2 is worth it? Do you have a Switch 2? And did you upgrade from a Switch 1? And did you feel like that was a worthwhile upgrade? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you liked what you saw, don't forget to leave a like down below and subscribe to see more content just like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.